My wife's body was never recovered from the lake. That was 14 months ago. 3 days ago, I watched her pay for groceries at a Walmart 2 counties over and walk out to a car I had never seen before. I am 58 years old. My name is Russell Hale. I ran a small commercial roofing company called Hale Exterior Solutions out of Kearney, Nebraska for 23 years. I built that company from a pickup truck and a used nail gun, and 3 guys I knew from high school who needed work. By the time my wife disappeared, we had 41 employees and contracts across 4 counties. Her name was Carol. We had been married for 31 years. The accident happened on a Thursday in late October, 14 months ago. She had taken her sister's boat out on Lake McConaughy alone, which was not unusual. She had been doing that since before we met. She knew that lake. She grew up a mile from it. The Coast Guard found the boat drifted into the shallows near the north shore with the motor still running and her life jacket on the seat where she had left it. They searched for 4 days. They found nothing. The county coroner issued a death certificate based on the circumstances, the water temperature, and the time elapsed without a body. They told me that in those conditions, in that part of the lake, recovery was not always possible. I buried an empty casket. My brother stood on my left and my sister-in-law stood on my right, and about 60 people I knew came and said the things people say and shook my hand and left. I learned how to live with a version of grief that has no object. No grave to stand at. No body to say goodbye to. You just carry the absence around with you like a weight with no shape. I did not go to Walmart that morning with any expectations. I went because I needed motor oil and a case of water, and I had been putting off errands for 2 weeks. I was in the automotive section looking at wiper blades when I heard a laugh from the next aisle over. A specific kind of laugh, short and a little surprised, like something had caught her off guard. A laugh I had heard 10,000 times across 31 years of mornings and dinner tables and bad television and long car rides. I told myself no. I told myself my brain was doing what brains do when they have been carrying something too long. Then I walked to the end of my aisle, and I looked around the corner. She was standing in front of the paper towel display with another woman I did not recognize, maybe early 40s. And they were talking about something that had made my wife laugh, that particular laugh. She was wearing a gray fleece pullover I had never seen before. Her hair was shorter, maybe 2 or 3 inches, and she had stopped coloring it the way she always did. It was mostly silver now, with some darker strands near the front. She looked good. She looked rested. My wife had a habit of standing with her weight shifted onto her right foot when she was relaxed. Her left heel would come up just slightly, almost imperceptibly, like she was about to start walking somewhere but hadn't decided yet. She was standing exactly that way. I stood at the end of the automotive aisle and I did not move. She turned to look at something on the shelf, and that was when I saw her left hand. Specifically, the second finger of her left hand. 26 years ago, she caught that finger in a storm door at her mother's house and broke it badly enough that it never set quite straight. A small permanent bend inward at the first knuckle. Her wedding ring had always sat slightly crooked because of it. She was not wearing a ring, but the finger was bent the same way it had always been bent, and no 2 people share a crooked knuckle like that. I backed up into the automotive aisle and stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably 45 seconds. Something in me said, "Do not speak, not yet." Whatever this was, the wrong move was to walk around that corner and say her name. I understood that in the same way you understand certain things without being able to explain why, the way you know when a job site is going wrong before anyone has told you anything. I went around the long way, through sporting goods, and came out near the front of the store where I could watch the registers without being seen from her angle. I found a spot near a display of outdoor furniture, and I waited. She came through register 7 11 minutes later. The woman she had been talking to was not with her. She paid with a card, not cash. She moved through that transaction with the ease of someone who had been coming to this particular store for a while, someone who knew where the bags were before the cashier reached for them. She had 1 cart. She loaded it herself in the parking lot, folded the cart into the return rack the same way she always did, and got into a white Subaru Outback with South Dakota plates. I was close enough to read the plate. I wrote it on the back of a receipt from my glove box. I drove home to Kearney. I did not call anyone. I sat at my kitchen table with the receipt in front of me and a cup of coffee I'd made and forgotten to drink, and I went through every rational explanation available. A woman who looked remarkably like Carol, same build, same hair color now that Carol had let hers go silver, same laugh, same posture, same standing habit, same crooked finger. The finger was not a coincidence. The finger was a medical fact. I had held that hand for 31 years. I knew two things before I went to bed that night. First, I was not going to call Carol's sister, who had spent 14 months grieving her. Second, I was not going to do anything impulsive. I had built a company from nothing by understanding that the worst decisions are made in the first 30 minutes after something goes wrong. I thought about who I needed to talk to. I had met a private investigator named Douglas Fenn 3 years earlier, when I hired him to look into a subcontractor I suspected of billing fraud. He had done good work, discreet. He found what he found and presented it without drama, and that was that. I still had his number in my phone. I called him the following morning and asked if I could meet him that afternoon. He said yes. We met at a diner on the edge of town, and I told him everything, starting from the accident and ending with the Walmart parking lot. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me to write down the plate number on a napkin, which I did. He told me to give him a week. He called me on day 6 and asked me to come to his office. His office was in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a vape shop. He had a desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard on wheels, and a filing cabinet that looked like it had survived a move or two. He had a folder on the desk. He pushed it across to me, and I opened it. The first document was a copy of a Nebraska driver's license issued 7 months ago. The name on it was Patricia Mercer. The photograph was my wife's face. I had to set the folder down for a moment. I looked at the whiteboard. It had nothing written on it. I looked at it anyway. The Subaru was registered to Patricia Mercer at an address in Chadron, Nebraska, about 340 miles northwest of Kearney. Douglas had cross-referenced the name against property records. Patricia Mercer had purchased a 2-bedroom house in Chadron outright, no mortgage, 11 months ago, paid in full. Behind the property records were bank account statements. An account opened 14 months ago, 1 week before the accident, at a credit union in Rapid City, South Dakota. The account was in the name Patricia Mercer. The opening deposit was $42,000 in cash. Behind that were transfer records that Douglas had obtained through a contact he did not name. Over a period of approximately 3 years, money had moved from our joint business account at Hale Exterior Solutions into a series of accounts I did not recognize. The transfers were always between $8,000 and $20,000, never round numbers, always spaced at least 6 weeks apart. The total Douglas had been able to document was $680,000. I had not noticed because Carol handled our household accounts. She had since the beginning of the company because she was better at it than I was, and I trusted her with it completely and had not looked closely at those accounts in years. She had signing authority as a co-owner. She was the one who processed payroll. She was the one who filed our quarterly taxes. She was the one who told me every January how the company had performed. I closed the folder and put my hands flat on the desk. Douglas said that what he had found was enough to take to law enforcement, but that he wanted me to know the picture was not complete. He had not yet found evidence of how she had arranged the accident or whether anyone had helped her. He said those answers would likely come during the investigation, not before. I asked him one question before I left. I asked him whether my oldest son had any connection to what he had found. My son had worked at Hale Exterior Solutions for 4 years running operations. He had access to some of our financial systems. Douglas said he had found no indication of that. He said the transfers were structured in a way that pointed to someone with direct account access, not someone working around a system. He said the evidence pointed to one person. I thanked him and drove home. My oldest son and I are close in the way that fathers and sons who have worked together are close. We have disagreements and long silences and stretches where we don't say what we mean. But I know him. I know how he carries things. When Carol died, or when we believed she had died, he was the one who came over 3 nights a week for the first 2 months and sat with me without needing to fill the silence. He brought food he cooked himself, which he had never done before. It mattered more than I told him at the time. When I sat across from him at my kitchen table that evening and put a photograph in front of him, a photograph Douglas had taken of my wife walking to her car outside a gas station in Chadron, my son looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Dad." Just that. Not "that's not her." Not "you're imagining things." Not "grief does this to people." Just my name. The way he had said it when he was 8 and had broken something in the garage and knew I already knew. I asked him how long. He said he had found out 9 months ago. He said he had come across something in the financial records he didn't understand, a transfer he didn't recognize, and he had called his mother to ask about it. She had told him the truth. She had told him she needed him to stay quiet. She told him she had left a bad situation and that she was safe, and that asking him to keep the secret was the last thing she would ever ask of him. He said he had believed that it was done, that she was gone and not coming back, and that telling me would only destroy me for no outcome. He said he had convinced himself that was protecting me. I listened to all of it. I did not raise my voice. I have never been a man who yells. When things go wrong, I get quiet, and the quieter I get, the worse the situation is, and that evening I was very quiet. I told him I needed to speak with an attorney and that until I did, he was not to contact his mother. I told him I was not asking. He said he understood. I left his house and drove to mine, and I sat in the dark in the living room for a while before I turned any lights on. The attorney I called the next morning was a woman named Vera Stanton. She had practiced law in Nebraska for 20 years, and I had used her for contract disputes twice and found her to be exact and unsentimental in a way I respected. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, and her desk was clean in the way that says organized rather than unoccupied. She read through Douglas's folder for 12 minutes while I waited. She read everything. She did not skim. When she closed it, she looked at me and said we needed to talk about scope before we talked about next steps. She said what the records showed was not a divorce. What the records showed was fraud. Wire fraud, because the transfers had been routed through interstate financial systems. Theft of business assets, because Carol had been a co-owner of Hale Exterior Solutions and the money she transferred was drawn from business accounts. Identity fraud, because the Patricia Mercer documentation involved a fabricated Social Security history and falsified state identification, and a charge she said she had seen once in her career, staging a disappearance to collect the presumption of death, which in Nebraska carried its own criminal weight, depending on whether any financial benefits had been paid out as a result. I told her my life insurance carrier had paid out $400,000 following the death certificate. She made a note. She said the documentation Douglas had assembled was strong, but that direct testimony from someone inside the situation would significantly strengthen the case. She said my son's knowledge and his phone record showing 9 months of contact with his mother would be relevant to any prosecution. She said something else. She said that Carol's new identity, Patricia Mercer, had apparently been used to open financial accounts, register property, and obtain a driver's license. Any of those actions required a paper trail, and that paper trail was, in legal terms, evidence that did not require my testimony to exist. She asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told her I wanted to proceed in a way that put the truth on record. Not because I wanted punishment for its own sake. Because I had buried a casket. Because my son had spent 9 months lying to my face while he watched me learn how to eat dinner alone. Because 60 people stood in the cold at a graveyard and said goodbye to someone who was not there. Because the insurance company that had paid out $400,000 had done so in good faith and deserved to know they had been defrauded. Vera said she understood. She said she would file the complaint with the district attorney's office by the end of the week. Before I left, she raised one thing I had not considered. She said Carol's attorney would likely argue that the Patricia Mercer identity had been constructed without Carol's direct involvement in the insurance payout, that the death certificate had been issued by the coroner's office based on circumstantial evidence and that Carol had not filed a claim herself. She said the insurance fraud charge was the most complex to establish because of that. I told her that was her problem to solve. She said she thought she could solve it. On a Thursday afternoon, 12 days after I had first seen my wife at that Walmart, I drove to Chadron. It took 4 hours and 40 minutes. I had made the drive once before, years ago, when a supplier I was considering had a warehouse there, and I had gone to look at it in person. I remembered the town as flat and quiet and edged by dry hills to the north. That memory turned out to be accurate. I found the address from the property records. A 2-bedroom house on a residential street with a spruce tree in the front yard and a metal mailbox with no name on it. There was a small vegetable garden along the south side of the house. Tomato cages, still up from the summer, the plants long since finished. Carol had always kept a garden. Every house we lived in, she found the sunniest side and put something in the ground. I had not intended to go to the door that day. My original plan was to see the house and leave, to confirm the location and hand that confirmation to Douglas for his records. But I sat in my truck at the end of the block for 20 minutes, and I realized that plan was not going to hold. I drove down the street and parked in front. I walked up to the door. She answered on the second knock. The moment she saw me, she did not move. She did not reach to close the door. She did not make a sound for several seconds. She looked exactly the same as she had always looked to me, and also completely different, the way a room looks after someone has moved the furniture. I said her name. Not Patricia, her name. She said mine. I told her I had spoken with an attorney. I told her the district attorney's office had been contacted and that she should expect to hear from law enforcement within the next few days. I told her she should get her own attorney before that happened. She asked me how I had found her. I told her she had left her cart in the exact right rack at the Walmart in Valentine and walked to her car the exact same way she had walked to every car in every parking lot for 31 years. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not name. Not quite guilt, and not quite surprise, and not quite grief, something that contained all of those without being any of them cleanly. She said she was sorry. I told her I believed that. I also told her that belief and consequence were two separate things and that she had built herself a very significant set of consequences. I walked back to my truck. She was still standing in the doorway when I pulled away from the curb. The arrest happened 2 days later. Vera called me at 8:15 in the morning to let me know that Carol had been taken into custody the previous evening, that the Patricia Mercer accounts had been frozen, and that the DA's office was treating the insurance payout as part of the fraud case, given evidence that Carol had communicated with an attorney prior to the accident about assets, which established prior planning. The charges were substantial: identity fraud, wire fraud, theft of business assets, staging a disappearance with intent to defraud an insurance carrier. Vera said a few of them would likely be consolidated before trial, but the core of the case was airtight. My son called me that morning. I let him call 3 times before I answered. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say things when they have run out of anything else to say, which I recognized because I had heard my wife say it at my front door 48 hours earlier. I had spent 31 years married to this woman, and neither she nor my son had any idea what I would do when the thing I had spent my life building turned out to have a different structure than I thought. I told my son that I was not going to pretend nothing had happened. I also told him that he was my son, and that was a fact that had not changed and was not going to change. I told him that what needed to happen next would happen, and that he needed to cooperate fully with the district attorney, not as a favor to me, but because it was the correct thing to do. He did. He provided a full statement. His phone records were subpoenaed and entered into evidence. Vera told me his cooperation was a meaningful contribution to the case. The legal process moved the way legal processes do, not fast, but steadily. Carol's attorney entered a not guilty plea on the identity and disappearance charges, but entered a separate negotiated plea on the wire fraud and business asset counts. The insurance company pursued a civil claim for the $400,000 payout and recovered most of it through the frozen Patricia Mercer accounts before the criminal sentencing was even scheduled. My son was not charged. The DA reviewed his involvement and determined that his conduct, receiving information and failing to report, fell short of the criminal threshold for conspiracy, given that he had not participated in the planning or execution of the scheme. He cooperated, and he was not charged. That was what I had told Vera I was hoping for, and I was grateful it worked out that way. There are things about my wife of 31 years that I may never have clear answers to. I know she was unhappy. I know she had been unhappy for longer than she told anyone, because she had been building her exit for at least 3 years before she used it. I know she was capable of sitting across a dinner table from me and making small talk about the news while she was routing 6-figure transfers through accounts I did not know existed. I know she stood in a graveyard and watched 60 people grieve her. What I do not know is the specific moment she decided that this was the answer. I have thought about it a lot, and I have come to the conclusion that the specific moment does not matter as much as I initially believed it did. The decision was not made in a moment. It was made over years, one small transaction at a time, one careful choice at a time, the way anything large is built, the way I built a roofing company from a pickup truck, one job at a time. The house felt different that winter, not empty the way it had felt for the 14 months when I thought she was dead. Different in a way that was harder to describe and took me longer to settle into. The 14 months I had spent grieving were real months. The grief was real grief. The fact that she was alive did not retroactively undo what I had felt during that time. That was something I had to work through on my own, the way you work through things that do not have a clean resolution. I hired a new operations manager at Hale Exterior Solutions, a woman named Barbara who had 20 years in commercial construction and who I found through an industry contact in Omaha. She was organized and direct, and I had no history with her, which turned out to matter more than I expected. My son and I talked on the phone once a week through that winter, short calls. We did not talk about his mother. We talked about work and about his kids, my grandchildren, who were 4 and 6, and who wanted nothing from this situation except their grandfather to show up on the right days, which I made sure to do. I started going to a different church than the one Carol and I had attended together. A smaller one, a congregation I did not know, which meant nobody came up to me before the service with a look I recognized and a hand on my shoulder. I could sit in the back and be somebody who had not been through anything in particular. That was a relief that I had not anticipated needing. Vera called me in March to tell me Carol had accepted a plea agreement. 4 years in a federal facility on the wire fraud and conspiracy counts. The identity fraud charges were reduced. She would be eligible for supervised release after serving 2/3 of the sentence, assuming good behavior. 4 years felt both too long and not long enough, which I suppose means it was approximately right. I still drive past the Walmart in Valentine sometimes. I go through that town twice a year when I have a supplier meeting in the western part of the state. I have pulled into that parking lot twice since everything happened and walked inside and bought what I needed and left. It is a Walmart. It has a sporting goods section and a paper towel display and registers 7 on the far left. It is not a landmark. What it is the place where something that had been wrong for 3 years became something I could finally see. I am not telling this because I want anyone to see me as a man who was wronged and handled it well. I do not know how well I handled it. I know I did not blow it up. I know I got quiet when I needed to, and got facts when I needed facts, and asked for help from the right people. I know I made decisions I could defend later. What I want to say, if this ends up being useful to anyone, is this. 31 years is a long time to know someone, and still there were things about her I never saw. That is not a failure of attention. That is how it works when someone decides they are going to build a second life without telling you. You cannot see something that is being hidden from you by someone who is very good at hiding it, but the small things. The way she stood. The way she stood her cart. The specific bend of a finger I had held in hospital waiting rooms, and across dinner tables and in the dark during 31 winters. Those are not things you forget. Those are things that live in you without asking permission. Pay attention to the small things, not because they will always mean something, but because when they do mean something, they are the only reason you will know. I have thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this ended. Not in a philosophical way. In a practical way, the way a man who has run a business for 23 years thinks about it. Every outcome has a structure. Every structure was built by a series of decisions, and every decision was made by a person who understood what they were doing at the time they did it. Carol made her first decision 3 years before she ever got in that boat. That is the part that still lands differently than the rest of it. Not the accident, not the identity, not the name Patricia Mercer on a driver's license with her face on it. The part that changed something permanent in how I see things is the timeline. 3 years. She sat across from me at that kitchen table for 3 years, making decisions, building an exit, while I talked about the business and asked her how her sister was doing and watched the news with her on the couch. I was not oblivious. I was trusting. I want to be clear about the difference, because I spent several months confusing the two, and that confusion was not useful. There is a version of this story where I became bitter, where I let what Carol did change the way I moved through the world, who I trusted, what I believed was possible in another person. I understood that version of myself. I could see exactly how a man arrives there. The casket. The 60 people in the cold. The 9 months my son spent lying to my face while he passed the bread at Sunday dinner. Those things have weight. They are allowed to have weight. But I watched what bitterness actually produces in people, and I decided I did not want what it produces. It does not produce justice. It does not produce clarity. It produces a man who has organized his entire interior life around someone else's wrong choices, and that is not a life. That is a reaction. What I chose instead was exactness. Get the facts. Find the right people. Move deliberately. Do not blow it up when a quiet match will do. That is not patience in the passive sense. That is discipline, and discipline is a thing you build the same way you build anything else, one decision at a time, starting with a decision to not do the loud thing when the loud thing is available to you. My son is working through his own version of this. He made choices that cost him something real and permanent, and he is going to carry that. I told him that carrying it honestly is better than setting it down by pretending it was smaller than it was. He is doing that. Some weeks better than others. That is enough. The thing I want to say, if any part of this is useful, is about paying attention. Not paranoid attention, not suspicious attention. Just the ordinary, consistent act of actually seeing what is in front of you. The crooked finger. The way she sorted the cart. 31 years of small details that lived in me without my permission and turned out to be the only thing I had. We spend a lot of time being told to let things go, to move on, to not hold too tightly. That is good advice most of the time. But there is a different kind of attention that is not about holding on. It is about knowing what is real. It is about trusting the part of you that has been keeping score even when you weren't watching. That part is not grief, and it is not wishful thinking. It is just accumulated truth. Trust it, then get the facts, then move.